Good morning to you. If you got your New Testaments with you this morning, be opening up to Matthew chapter 25. Mateo capítulo 25, Matthew chapter 25. That's where we're going to find a beginning place for our study this morning. And it's where we're going to spend most of our time this morning. So if you've got your New Testament, be opening up there. That's where we'll get started. You'll be ahead of the game being in that passage. We have visitors in our audience this morning. We're thankful that you're here. If you are able to stick around a little while after services so that we can meet you and get to know you a little bit better, we sure would appreciate that. We'll meet again this evening at 5 o'clock, and if you're in the area and able to worship with us then, we'd love to see you. In Matthew chapter 25, we encounter one of the more familiar parables of Jesus. It's the parable of the talents. Three men who are employed in the service of their master. Their master is going on a journey. He calls the three men to himself, and he gives each one of them an allotment. And he charges them to take care of this, to make good use of it, to be good stewards of what I have given you, and when I return, you are to return to me that which is mine. And perhaps you know the rest of this story. Two of the men do what they're supposed to do, and then there is one man who does nothing. He takes what is given to him. He does nothing with it. And because of that, he is rebuked. And he loses everything. And it's the principles from this story that I want us to look at this morning and study together as we think about the high cost of wasted potential. In Matthew 25, if you turn over here with me to verse 14, this is where our parable begins. The man entrusts his possessions to his three different servants. One of them, in verse 16, receives 5 talents, the other receives 2 talents, and the last receives 1 talent. In verse 19, the master returns and he begins to settle accounts. The one with 5 in verse 20 comes to him and says, "See, I have gained here 5 more," and he turns it over to the master. And he is told in verse 21, "Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many. Enter into the joy of your master." The same thing with the man who had 2. And to the man who had received 1 talent, this is verse 24, verso 24. "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you had scattered no seed. I was afraid, and I went and I hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours." And the master said to him, "You wicked and lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. So take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he shall have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. But cast the worthless slave into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing." This is a parable. And as we go through parables in our New Testaments, parables have one overarching central idea at which they are driving. We make a mistake when we read the parables and we're trying to pull out details on every subtlety that's in the parable. Parables drive at one central idea. As we're trying to understand Matthew 25 here and this parable, the meaning of this parable, its primary meaning is this, is that I need to make use of whatever abilities and talents I have in the service of my master. I need to make sure I'm like the man with 5 talents and the man with 2 talents, and that I'm not like the man who had the 1 talent. I need to make use of the abilities and the blessings and the talents with which I have been blessed. That is the overarching meaning of Matthew 25. But to arrive at that meaning, we have to work through some of the details of this parable. To some of us, the details are rather simple. To others, they're rather challenging. I'm reminded of the time that my cousin, Luke, preached on a passage from 2 Corinthians about being unequally yoked to others. And as he started the sermon, he made sure everyone in the audience, 10 and under, had a piece of paper. And as he began, he said, okay, he read the passage and says, I want you to take 2 minutes and I want you to draw a yoke. And you know what nearly everyone did who had a pencil and a piece of paper? They drew, of course, an egg yolk, right? Because when we hear that, that's what we're thinking, right? Now, in Matthew 25, we are talking about these men, and what differentiates them are their abilities, and they are given what? Based on their abilities, they're given talents. And when we think about talents, maybe we're thinking like talent shows, right? That these are innate abilities that we have. These are gifts that we have been given by God. And I don't know that that's necessarily a misunderstanding, but I don't think that is the best understanding here. Personal ability is not what the focus of this text is. In the parable, if we're reading the parable as it is written, a talent is some form of currency, right? If you're reading from the New International Version, I think it makes it really clear. Millie, are you paying attention? If you're reading from the NIV, this makes it really clear because the NIV is going to use the phrase bags of silver. Other translations, bags of gold. And it communicates the idea more clearly. We're not talking about personal abilities. That's not the focus of the parable as it is given. It's a communication about a form of currency. Well, okay, a form of currency. What is that all about? A talent, the Net Bible says, was a huge sum of money equal to about 6,000 denarii, and 1 denarius was the usual day's wage for a laborer. So a talent would equal the wages for 6,000 days of work. Now let's put that in terms that you and I would understand. While the average U.S. Worker makes about $21 an hour, the median amount of money that the U.S. worker makes per hour is about $19. $19 an hour. So take your $19 an hour, let's say you're working an 8-hour day, standard day, that's going to give you $152 a day. Now take that 152 and multiply it by 6,000. That's 6,000 days of work. And what number do you get? $912,000. So let's round it off and call it $1 million. So number one, we find out that this master is extraordinarily wealthy, right? 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent. My Arkansas math tells me that's 8 talents. $8 million he has to give to these men, to these servants of his. And he trusts them, right? They each have varying levels of ability, but he trusts them all. He gives to all of them. Notice that there in chapter 25 and verse 15. He gave to each one according to his own ability. Doles out $8 million. $5 million to one guy, $2 million to one guy, $1 million to another. Now we look, and rightly so, we look with some skepticism upon the 1 talent man over here, but recognize he was just entrusted with $1 million. How often have you and I been entrusted with $1 million? I have not. I don't know about you. I have not been entrusted with $1 million, and that would frighten me. To be put in charge of someone else's money, a staggering amount of money like that, would be a challenge. It was a challenge for all of these men, yet they all responded differently. Again, the ESV Archaeology Study Bible indicates at the time of the New Testament, one talent was valued at about 6,000 denarii, equivalent to the wages of a common laborer for 6,000 days. Put it another way, just over 19 years of work. 19 years of labor. The one talent man is placed over. That's why the New Living Translation calls it bags of silver. The New International Version calls it bags of gold. Put over a fantastic amount of money here. And is told to take care of it, use it appropriately, and then when I return, I will receive back what is mine. So the man who was given $5 million does what? Doubles it. The man who was given $2 million does what? Doubles it. So we go there from $7 million to $14 million. And then here's our one talent man. And what does he do? He takes what was given to him, and the text tells us that he buried it in the ground. Verse 18, verso 18. He who received the one talent went away and dug in the ground, and he hid his master's money. Knowing that his master was a fearful man, knowing that he was a man who was hardworking, who gathered where he had not scattered, said, I was afraid, and I went and I hid your talent in the ground, and see, there you have what is yours. The master's understandably angry. I don't walk away from this with the impression that the master is angry that his one talent was not doubled into 2 talents. How often do we invest our money and expect 2 times back what we put in? All right? If Daniel could accomplish that day in and day out, Daniel would be the mayor of San Antonio. He just wanted something back. He says, right? He says what? You should have just at the least done what? Put it in the bank, and I would have received back my own plus interest. Right? But you didn't even do that. And so the master says what? Verse 28, take the talent away from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. $1 million, the master says, take that $1 million away. Don't give it to me. Do you catch that? Have you caught that before? Don't give it to me. Give it to the guy who doubled my money the most. Give it to him. And then verse 29. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he shall have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. What does Jesus mean by that? That's one of those hard statements of Jesus in Scripture. What does Jesus mean when he says, but from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away? How can you take away from someone who doesn't have anything? How do you subtract from 0? Right? Obviously, this is a statement of hyperbole here. Jesus is not asking us to sit down and do some sort of arithmetic here. He's driving at a point, and so we need to ask ourselves, at what point is he driving? Well, number one, what Jesus is describing in verse 29 is not final judgment. We need to recognize that. Final judgment comes in verse 30. In verse 30, he says to this wicked servant, cast out the worthless slave into outer darkness. In that place there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Verse 30 is when final judgment comes in. Verse 29 is not final judgment. So he's talking about something short of final judgment. So then what is he talking about? It's the same kind of language he has used in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 12, if you're interested in reading that. Tack Chumley, in his commentary on the book of Matthew, I think has something interesting to say here. He describes this as being the law of spiritual atrophy. And then he quotes, I believe that's Dr. Henry Morris, who says, anyone who has a talent, and we'll use the word talent in the modern sense of the word, anyone who has a talent of any kind and fails to use it, by that very fact, he forfeits it. You have something, but you never use it. By the very fact that you never use it, you forfeit it. In that way, from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken from him. If we've been given something, but we use it not at all, if we neglect it, if we fail to put it into play in our lives and the lives of others to do any sort of good, if we fail to use it in that sense, then do we even have it at all? It's like we don't. And that's Jesus' point here. What good is a talent? What good is a blessing if we don't use it? Which is the very point of this parable when we go back to the start, right? The very point is, whatever we have been blessed with, we need to use it in the service of our master. And that's the very point that condemns this man. He was given a blessing and he didn't use it. He didn't use it for his master. He didn't use it for anyone else. He had potential. Chapter 25 and verse 15 reveals that. He had potential. And he wasted it. The master's view of the servant was that they were all capable of handling what he gave them. He gave to each one of them in verse 15 according to their own ability. He was not giving these people something for which they were unequipped or ill-equipped. He knew they had abilities, and he gave to each one of them according to their abilities. The man who was given 5 talents evidently had more ability to handle a larger amount than the guy who only had 1. But the guy who only had 1 still had ability. He was still capable. What distinguishes the 1 talent man is not the fact that he had no ability, because he did. He was different than the others, just like you and I and everyone else in there. We're all different, but we all have abilities. This man still had ability. But what distinguished the 1 talent man, number 1, is that he doesn't act immediately. Look at chapter 25 and verse 16. Verso 16. The man who received the 5 talents immediately went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In verse 17, in the same manner, the one who received the 2 talents gained 2 more. They both act how? Immediately. And then you come to the 1 talent man. You come to the 1 talent man in verse 18. And he went away and he dug in the ground and he hid his master's money. We don't know anything about the speed with which he does this. But the way that Jesus phrases this would seem to indicate he's not acting immediately. And when he finally does get around to acting, it's not to trade, but it's to dig in the ground. Now let's return back to what we were talking about at the start. Imagine someone comes to you and says, hey, here's $912,000, invest this for me. There are some in this audience who are very well equipped to do that. I have no doubts. I would be shaking in my boots. If someone comes to me and tells me to invest this and they expect me to bring them a return on their investment, that's not one of my talents. I would not be the 1 talent man in this story. I wouldn't be the 5 talent man or the 2 talent man either. He wouldn't be giving me $912,000 because that's not my ability to handle that. This man had the ability. He was given this money precisely because he had demonstrated the ability to handle this. So what distinguishes him? In the parable, what distinguishes him? He doesn't act immediately. And then look at verses 25 and 26. Verso 25 y 26. As the accounts are being turned back over to the master, the one talent man says, I was afraid. I can relate to that. Except he has an ability that I don't have. So there's a difference between me and him. He says, I was afraid, and I went and I hid your talent in the ground. See, you have there what is yours. And the master answered and said to him, what? Words are important here. You wicked and what? Lazy servant. What distinguished the one talent man from the 5 talent man and the 2 talent man? Do you notice in the master's response in verse 26? He doesn't say anything about the man being afraid. He knew the man had the ability. What was the problem with this man? His inaction was not due to reverence. His inaction was not due to fear. His inaction was due to one thing, and what was it? He was lazy. He was lazy. He tries to play it off as something else. I knew how much of a man to be esteemed you are. I know you to be a hard man, verse 24, reaping where you do not sow, gathering where you scattered no seed. And so, because I know about how great of a man you are, I was afraid. Little me before big you, I was afraid. And so I went out and I took your $1 million and I dug a hole and I put it there. Now notice this. Does he even bring the money to his master? It's as though he is pointing to a hole in the ground out there somewhere saying, what? There's your money. This is laziness, isn't it? This is poor stewardship and laziness. This servant was not worthless to begin with, but his choices made him worthless. And it cost him everything. Even what he has, take it away from him and cast him into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The high cost of wasted potential. So how might we do that today? It's a cautionary tale, right? It's not one that we want to follow, and this is not a plan for us to emulate in our lives, but it's a warning to us. How do we make sure we don't do what the one talent man did? How do we make sure we don't waste our potential today? That picture there is of a Roman shovel in a museum today, not unlike what the one talent man would have used to go and dig his hole and put, think about it, $1 million in a hole. And for what we know about the other parables of Jesus, there were folks all over Judea at this time just going around digging for buried treasure, right? Does he take care of his master's goods? Does he use them responsibly? Is he a good steward? No. Why does he put it in the ground? Because he's lazy. How do we make sure we don't waste our potential today? We waste our potential today when we attempt to make our laziness noble. You and I waste our potential today when we attempt to make our laziness an act of nobility. That's exactly what the one talent man does here, right? He tries to dress it up in all sorts of different ways. I knew you had these rigorous ideas. I knew that you had lofty standards, and I just can't meet those. So I'm not even going to try. The lesson is to try. You may not succeed, but try. Story time. My first year of college. My first year at Stephen F. Austin State University, my aunt and uncle, who I lived with part of that year, my aunt was still working as a school teacher. And I got there into Nacogdoches a couple of weeks before school started, both college and public. And she was getting her room ready. Asked me, hey, would you come up and help me with this? Sure, absolutely, glad to do it. And then she handed me a stapler, and she handed me the runners that go around a bulletin board. Said, hey, will you just put this up around the bulletin board? Uh-ohs are going off in my head. I have some talents. Artistic talents are not them. And you might be thinking, putting stuff on a bulletin board is not artistic. It requires artistic ability, let me tell you. You've got to have a good eye for getting those staples in. I mean, I got done with that thing, and it was hanging, and it was warped and bent. I'm just awful at that stuff. My mom and my aunt, to this day, the next time they are here, you can ask them, to this day, they think that I did that intentionally so my aunt would never ask me to help out in her classroom again. I am telling you here this morning in the pulpit, I tried my hardest. I am just not good at that. It's not my talent. But I did what? I tried. We all learned a lesson. My aunt never asked me back to do that again. Now, she would ask me for help with technology stuff. I could help her with that. Reach something up here. Hey, I'm really good at reaching stuff up high. Don't ask me to draw. Don't ask me to make something straight. I'm terrible at it. The accusation was that, Tyler, you were lazy. You just didn't want to do it. Well, if I was like the one-talent man, that'd be exactly right. That's what was going on with him, right? It's this attitude. We've seen it before. Maybe you've seen it in yourself. Hopefully not, but maybe we've seen it in our friends. You attempt nothing and you'll never fail. Attempt nothing and you'll never be disappointed. Remember, we had a friend when we were growing up together in Conway. Only thing he would ever do is he'd lead a song on singing night, same song every time, and he'd lead a closing prayer. Would never branch out. Would never try anything different. Why? Attempt nothing and you'll never fail. I found my niche. This is what I'm going to do. Now, hey, if you've tried and this is where you are, then that's where you are. And you've tried and you found out what your niche is, you found out what your abilities are, and use those in the glory of God. But if my mindset is this right here that we see in the one-talent man, that, hey, just not going to attempt anything and I'm never going to be disappointed, we will be disappointed just like the one-talent man was disappointed. We take the blessings we've been given and we are expected to use them to the glory of God. Because God views me as capable. Every one of us who are servants of God are capable. Are we all capable of the same thing? No. In the things in which we are capable, are we all capable to the same degree? No. I was talking with my daughter about this morning as we were driving to church, and I was doing my own little survey of her. I said, hey, who's your favorite song leader at church? It wasn't Dad. Dad's all right, but it wasn't Dad. It's okay, right? We all have abilities, and then some of us just excel at some abilities. There are some men here in this congregation who offer public prayers that I'm just absolutely envious of in the best way possible. I just don't have that ability, and I have tried. but I don't. Right? The men who can get up here and wait on the Lord's table and not freak out while they're doing it, I'm jealous. That gets in my head more than anything else. And I realize that's minuscule to some people. Here's what I'm trying to say. We have a really good ability to rationalize away behavior that's negative. Behavior that does not meet God's standard. And the challenge for you and me is to stop the rationalization and to simply attempt to do and to be what God wants us to be. It may be that we learn that I just don't have this ability, and that's okay. But we have learned that by the process of trying. But too often, the idea that infects our minds is that I'm just not going to try because what if I fail? Yeah, but what if you succeed? What if you take those 5 talents and you turn it into 10 talents? What if you take those 2 talents and turn it into 4 talents? Isn't that a whole lot better than just being given the 1 talent and going digging in the sand and never knowing what you can do with it? We waste our potential today when we attempt to make our laziness a sign of nobility. Going along with that then, we waste our potential today when we neglect to utilize the talents with which we've been blessed. Sometimes we know we have talents, we know we have abilities. And for one reason or another, we just don't use them. And we don't use them properly. Maybe it's because we've convinced ourselves that there's somebody out there that does it better than me. And you know what? Except for one person in the world, that's true of everybody. Right? There can only be one person at the top. There can only be one person who's best at anything. Everyone else is not the best by definition. There's a lot of us, and I include myself in this number, who are not the best at things, but yet we're still going to go out there and do things, not because we're the best. I mean, spoiler alert, I recognize I'm not the best preacher. Eddie's not here to amen that, and I'm really glad. I recognize that. But also recognize, to some degree, I've been given an ability, and God expects me to use that. Look in your life, what abilities has God given you? I've told a few of you the story of a man back in Longview, Texas that we worshiped with for 13 years. I never heard this man teach a Bible class. I never heard this man preach a lesson. Never heard this man make comments at the Lord's table. I don't know that I ever heard this man make a comment in Bible class. But you know what this man did? Any woman at the congregation that ever got pregnant, as soon as he found out about the very next Sunday, she had a footstool in her pew to put her feet up on to make sure she could be comfortable in the assembly. Every one of them got that. Is that preaching? Is that teaching? Is that making a comment in a Bible class? No. Is that using a talent with which you've been blessed to the glory of God? It absolutely is. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be grand. There were some women who would walk in and find that stool there for them and have no clue who built it and who put it there. Do folks have to know about it? No. But if we've been blessed with talents and abilities, we gotta use them. We gotta find a way to use them. It doesn't have to be in front of everybody. Folks don't have to know about it. But we've got to use those talents and abilities. You know, as it relates to the wealthy, this is something that Paul warned about. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 6 with me. Primero de Timoteo, capítulo 6, verso 17. 1 Timothy chapter chapter 6 and verse 17. Paul, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, warned wealthy Christians about failing to use their abilities to His glory, to help others, to spread the gospel. Beginning in verse 17, verso 17, Paul wrote and said, "Instruct those who are rich in this present age not to be conceited, and not to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed." For those who are wealthy, there's the very real danger that we always worry about what the next crisis might be, and we fail to see the present needs that are around us. The Spirit warns about that and says, look, if we have the ability, if God has given us this blessing, let us use this blessing to His glory. And the way to use it to His glory is not just to hoard it up and tuck it away and let it corrode like we see in the book of James. Rather, we utilize those talents and blessings that we've been given. Look at 1 John. John's going to talk about this principle as it relates to just the general concept of being a good neighbor. Look at 1 John chapter 4. Primero de Juan, capítulo 4, verso 20. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 20. John says this, "If someone says, 'I love God,' and hates his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from Him, that the one who loves God should love his brother also." We can't claim to love God while at the same time failing to love those who are around us. You go back to 1 John chapter 3, you find out what loving those who are around us really means. Let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. It's not a all shucks, bless their hearts kind of affair. It's a looking to the needs of those who are around us and being active in reaching out to those needs and taking care of those who are around us. That's what being a good neighbor, that's what loving our neighbors ourselves actually looks like. But when we've been blessed as richly as we are in this country, and we fail to love those who are around us, that's a preeminent way in which we waste our potential today. That instead of being that 5-talent or 2-talent man, we become that 1-talent man who takes his abilities and his blessings and digs a hole and puts it there. Then I want you to think that the Hebrew writer warned about this in the church. Look at Hebrews chapter 10. Look at Hebrews chapter 10. Hebreos capítulo 10, verso 24. Sometimes talent is woodworking. Sometimes talent is preaching or teaching or leading. But sometimes the ability with which we have been blessed is simply the ability to be present. And perhaps we don't think about that too much until it's one that we love who's unable to be present for an extended period of time. Or it's when we look around and we see a pew that's been empty and empty and empty, not because the person wants to be gone, but because they just can't be here. Doesn't that say something to those of us who have the ability to be here? Listen to what the writer of Hebrews under the inspiration of the Spirit says. Look at verse 24, verso 24. let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good works. So let's think about ways that we can encourage each other. Verse 25. The Spirit identifies one key way in which we can make sure that we do encourage one another. Not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin. I've heard the arguments about this passage. I've heard the arguments about verse 25, that the form of the verb there in verse 25 for forsaking is not describing a one-time event, but it's describing an ongoing and persistent process. And while there may be some credence to that, that same form of the verb is going to be used in Ephesians and Colossians when Paul tells us to stop lying. He's not telling us to stop habitual lying, but a lie every now and then is okay, and we recognize it in that case. We need to recognize the same principle here in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25. That if you and I have the ability to be here, and I recognize there are things that can legitimately impair our ability to be here. I recognize sometimes we're sick, and hey, if you're sick, I don't want you here. Right? We spread germs bad here. If you're sick, don't come. All right? Don't want you here. Love you, stay home, get better, then come, and then we want to see you, right? I understand sometimes we have to work, and we can't be here. I get that. I get that sometimes we're taking care of loved ones who can't take care of themselves. I get all of that. And I'm pretty well convinced the Lord gets that too. But brethren, I'm not concerned about that right now. I'm talking about those times when you and I have the ability to be here. We have the capability to be here. And we just decide, you know what? That 5 o'clock headache just showed up. And man, 1604 is just not pleasant. Spoiler alert, when is 1604 ever pleasant to drive on? The answer is never. Okay, so throw that excuse out. Let's boil it down to what is I just. Here's where all the I just lead. Hey, it's not that important to me. That's where all the I justs lead. Because let me tell you, if it was important, if it was absolutely important to me to be here, then guess what? I'd be here. I'd be here. Again, I'm not talking about those times when we don't have the ability. I'm not talking about that. And let me just say for the record, in case we have missed it up to this point, I understand there are times when we cannot be here. I get it. I'm not talking about that. There are times when we can be here. And if we choose not to be here, that concerns me. And I worry that when we're talking about wasting our potential like the one-talent man, and when we see the context of Hebrews 10 here, and we see verse 24, encourage, and verse 25, encourage, that you and I have a golden opportunity to encourage ourselves and others by the mere fact of our presence here together, and we choose not to do that. Tell me how that's any different than digging a hole and putting our talent in it and walking away. We waste our potential when we have the ability to serve and we don't use it. And then we waste our potential today, and this is what we'll end on this morning. We waste our potential today when we fail to glorify God in our lives. Remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount there in Matthew chapter 5? City that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Men don't light a lantern and put it under a basket, but they put it on a lampstand so it gives light to all who are in the house. And then what does he say? Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. What is God's design for your life and my life? God's design for our lives is that we would live lives of public and noticeable godliness. God wants you, God wants me to live a life in public that glorifies Him. That means doing those things that glorify Him, and that means avoiding those things that would not glorify Him. Now look at Matthew chapter 6. Look at Matthew chapter 6 and verse 23. Mateo capítulo 6, verso 23. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 23. We're to be that light in the world. We're to glorify God by the manner in which we live publicly. Listen to what Jesus says here. Beginning in verse 22, verso 22. The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you, the light that you are supposed to be, the light that we know we're supposed to be, if the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? We're supposed to be light. We know we're supposed to be light. Jesus tells us we're supposed to be light. But if the light that we are supposed to be is really darkness, how great is that darkness? And then don't miss the very next verse. No one can serve two masters. Either he loves the one and hates the other, or he clings to one and despises the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Put another way, you cannot serve God and fill in the blank. We got to choose. But if our choice is anything except God, if our choice to live for in this life, if our choice to glorify in this life is anything but God, what we are doing is digging the hole. And we're putting our coins in there. And when the master comes to make an account, we will be doing nothing more than saying, hey, there it is. And if we act in no way different than the one-talent man, what makes us think that our reward will be any different than his? Which was take from him what he had and cast the wicked and unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We have potential. We have abilities. We have seen that in this congregation time and time again. I'm thankful to be a part of a church that is as active as this church. I'm thankful for the many, many people here who do such good work and do it without seeking any sort of acclaim for it. Don't take anything that I said this morning as being indicative of some ground root problem we have here at University Oaks. I don't believe that. I don't think that, and I don't see that. But would it do any good to gloss over stories like this? We always need to be watchful, making sure that we're using our talents and abilities to glorify God in the manner that He would want. I'm thankful for this local church. I'm thankful for each and every member that comprises this local church. Even you, Brother Roach. I'm thankful for everyone here, and I want us to continue to get better. I want us to find even more talents and more abilities that we have and serve in more effective ways. But the last thing that I want is for any of us to have a talent, whether it be a big public talent, whether it be a relatively small talent, whether it's simply the ability to be here. I don't want any of us to have those abilities and instead of utilizing them, just digging a hole and putting it there, and then get the awfulest of surprises on the day that we have to give an account. I appreciate your attention this morning. If you look at your life and your life has been more like the one-talent man instead of the others, boy, what a wonderful opportunity this morning to change. We'd love to pray with you and to pray for you, to encourage you and to lift you up and to help you be where you need to be. Maybe You look at your life and you've never started this journey with Christ. Maybe you've never given your life over to Him as your Lord. Would you confess Jesus as your Savior? Would you turn from sin? Would you be united with Him in baptism and raised to walk a new life? If you're ready to do that, we're ready to help this morning. If you'd simply come while we stand and while we sing.